And now join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Barry O'Sullivan, who will deliver the annual New Directions Weir lecture, Professionalising Learning Systems. We will have a few minutes for questions at the end of the talk, so please use the chat function to send your questions. And hello to everybody who is sending message and then who is sending wishes to Mina.
Welcome, Professor. The stage is all yours.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can share now. Share screen. And yes. Okay, well, it's kind of weird. I can't actually see anything now except my own screen. So I'll be talking to myself for about 45 minutes. And as we just heard, we'll have a little bit of time, I hope plenty of time for questions at the end of this talk, because as far as I'm concerned, it's a very straightforward idea. The idea, I think, is relatively simple. Making it happen is a bit of a problem. I know that because there are many obstacles in the way, and there are many things to think about when we're trying to implement this whole system. I'm really delighted to be asked today to talk at this event because it's in honor of my friend, colleague, mentor, Professor Cyril Weir, who died a few years ago. He was a great guy. He did so much for language testing. He essentially redefined language testing in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and continued with that work for another decade or more in his work around the socio-cognitive framework that I worked with him on from, I suppose, about 1999. And his contribution to European particular, but world language testing has been enormous over the years. And I'd just like to tip my hat to him. He was a great guy in all kinds of ways. I would not be here without him, I'll put it like that. So I'm looking forward to this lecture forming a significant part of the Latin American language testing diet in the years to come. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'll talk about the problem, what I see as the problem in education systems today. I would then talk about the comprehensive learning system and go into some of it in a little bit of detail, because I do think that it's not fully understood the breadth of the issue and the breadth of the problem, and also the breadth of the solution. Then I'll think a little bit about how we can make that system work, because it's one thing to have a theoretical system. And having worked at universities for much of my adult life, I realized that a lot of the theories that we deal with, particularly in language testing, just don't work. So they're wonderful theories, but they don't work. So they don't actually really help us. So we have people on a regular basis standing up telling language testers and policymakers and test users how they should behave and how they should make tests when they've never actually made a test. The mind boggles me, the arrogance, I guess. But what we need to do is to think of the real practical implications of what we're talking about and the practical ideas of how we can make it work. And I'll finish with a few conclusions, and then we'll have some questions, I hope. And feel free to ask as many questions as you like. First of all, we'll think a little bit about the problem. Learning systems, I guess, are part of the problem, if you like. The reality of learning systems is that we have so many experts. Off the top of my head, I came up with this list. I didn't really think very long when I was doing it, but it didn't take me a lot of time to fill out the list with people who I know. And most of these people, these roles, we'll call them now, are taken by people I know. Like, I know quality assurance people, I know teacher trainers, I know policy influencers, I know commissioning editors and education data analysts, and education ministers. So we know all of these people, and they all have a role to play in the system. But there's a problem, because for the system to work, and I like to use this picture because Wayne Rooney was one of my favorite footballers and he played for my very favorite team, Manchester United. For him to score that wonderful goal that he did against our arch enemy, Manchester City, his whole team had to work together to get that ball into that right position so that he was in the right place to put it away. The problem that we have with our education systems is that we generally don't get that to work. We don't play as a team. And we often struggle to get people to even talk to each other. The problem is we work in silos, and silos is the problem. For many, many years, I've spoken to particularly teacher trainers and people working in curricula, materials developers, who just don't seem to see what the relevance of assessment is within the system. And I have to confess, I couldn't see the relevance of some of the things they were doing either, because I didn't fully understand what they were at, because I was too much engaged, I guess, in my own little box of language testing and understanding and learning more about the theories and the statistics and all of the numbers that go around it. The problem was that I was learning so much about all of these bits, I didn't realize that testing and assessment isn't a thing on its own. It shouldn't be a thing that sits on its own or stands on its own to one side of a system. It's got to be integrated into the system. It's going to be affected by all kinds of things within the system, within the society. And we'll come to that as we go through this talk. But for now, we leave that as the critical issue, silos. We've got to find a way to work across these silos and to break those silos down so that we have teams of people working, cross-disciplinary teams, understanding that education and learning systems themselves are cross-disciplinary. Without that cross-disciplinary knowledge, we don't have a system that is likely to work. The system that I've been talking about for many years and finally getting around to writing about it only fairly recently in any serious way is what I call the comprehensive learning system. And by that, I mean, learning is all about systems. We have to see the whole education construct, if you like, as a system. It's not simply a classroom. And it's not a teacher. Teachers are absolutely critical and central to it. Classrooms are critical and central to it. But all of these have got to work in tandem. All of the bits of the system have to work in tandem. So when we think of a comprehensive learning system, we think about the different elements of that system. The different elements of the system are, I would argue, fairly obvious and should be fairly clear to anybody who's involved in the system, in that we have the curriculum, which tends to drive the system, at least in theory. We have the delivery of that curriculum and everything around that. And then we have the assessment and all of the assessment that goes into that system. The idea being that all of these have got to be in tandem. They've got to work together, because if they don't work together, the system may not work. So we start to think a little bit about these elements now. First of all, let's think about the curriculum. We know that a curriculum has got to be context appropriate. Most sensible and sane people will build the curriculum to suit a particular learning context. So we've got to think about the context in terms of the educational context, the social context, the language context, and that could be languages, by the way, because, you know, I lived and worked in Peru, for example, many, many years ago, 35 years ago, where we had Spanish as the main language of the towns and cities, but we had Quechua, which was also a widely spoken language, which probably now is more involved with, there's more of a plurilingual approach to language policy in Peru than there was when I was there, but because times change and people learn more and understand more about the relevance of different languages within a culture. But we need to take those different languages in a culture into consideration when we're building that curriculum, because the curriculum has got to understand that it represents the whole of the context. So the cultural element, the language element, the social element, the education element. I'm not saying these are different elements. They're all overlapping and intertwined. The reason that the contexts are so dynamic, if you like, across even a region like Latin America, with generally a single language, apart from obviously the Portuguese. We have Spanish in most of the countries, but when you look around the different countries and you visit the different countries in Latin America, you realize that there may be a language in common, but man, the education systems, they're different. The social systems are different. Even the language is different. I remember having learned some fairly basic Spanish when I went to Peru first, going down to Chile and not realizing that in Chile, people didn't tend to finish the words, which for an Irishman who basically had never studied Spanish until he started reading the sports pages of the local newspaper, had no idea sometimes what people were talking about. Had a vague idea it was Spanish, but that was about it. So there are massive language differences, cultural differences, social differences, education differences. So the likelihood of a single curriculum for Latin America is, I'm sure you would all laugh if somebody suggested it, because it just could not work. Because to work, the curriculum has got to work within that social context and education context. A sensible curriculum, particularly nowadays, and particularly in times of COVID, takes into account not only the formal learning, and that is a formal learning in school, so the lessons that a person will learn in school or at home. Increasingly now we have online learning for students around the world. That has to be dealt with. But even in a traditional setting, students will have certain learning that they would be expected to undertake at home, as opposed to the schoolwork. But that's the formal learning system, where you're interacting with textbooks and you're doing homework and you're doing classwork and you're doing all of the stuff that we associate with schools and going to school and teaching in school. But more and more we have to realize that there is this informal learning context as well, that many people just don't seem to get. Young students particularly now are so familiar with technology that it's kind of frightening. You know, I have a grandson who's 4 who will interact with apps, TV, all kinds of games, even though his personal favorite are board games for some daft reason, but he loves his technology as well and really gets it. And he's got it for years. And even his little sister, who's a year old, she's already got the idea that if you touch a certain part of the screen, you can pause your television, and then gets upset because she hasn't yet figured out how to turn it back on again. But they're learning all the time. They're learning. They may not be learning language because it's all in English, but my grandson Scott speaks with an American accent. Like, he talks about tomatoes, and in Ireland that's just not done. Because he is learning, and he is obviously learning language in there as well, and he comes out with words that he's obviously not heard anywhere else. So this informal learning context can be very, very important. If we look at states like in what we find in Northern Europe, where they've stopped dubbing TV and films, and they put subtitles in. The idea being that you're exposing people to the language all the time. And it's generally accepted that that is just one, but it is one of the reasons why the language there is so strong. Their multiple languages are so strong because they're listening to and they're interacting with the language in all kinds of different contexts. Of course, games now are massively popular among all ages, and gaming is a particularly interesting way to learn a language. And I'm reminded of Cyril's son, who his mother is Japanese, and they went to Japan. He spoke in Japan, was Japanese was very good, but he didn't really read a huge amount. He did read some at the time. I guess he was about 9 or 10. And his grandmother gave him the most up-to-date game and a little small console. I can't remember what it's called, but she gave him this game that was like 3 generations beyond what you could get in Europe. He was absolutely thrilled, and then realized that everything was in Japanese. Everything in the game was Japanese. Everything in the manual was Japanese. But he was driven to read and understand the manual and to understand the games in Japanese. And he's reading Kimon 1,000%. He actually went back to the UK after his holiday, and he was teaching some of his friends Japanese so they could read the manual as well. So it shows you the power that games can have. But we can actually take some of these opportunities that are open to us and build into the curriculum the opportunities for this informal learning. So we can ensure as a ministry, for example, we can have a policy where we make apps available that are available for studying the target language, and that could be whichever language it is. I'm talking mainly about English, but it could be any language. We can also make decisions around films and TV subtitles, and about gaming. You can make English language versions of games more accessible, reduce the tax on them or whatever, make them a little bit more available to people. But the idea that I'm talking about here is that we don't just think of the traditional curriculum in terms of the formal curriculum sitting in a formal context. The contexts are changing now, and we're looking at different ways of learning and more informal and formal ways of learning, and maybe linking some of the formal learning into the informal learning. So introducing gaming into the learning environment, for example, which is something that has been done. I know in Ireland there has been a game done to help people to learn Irish, for example, and to learn for school kids to update their Irish, particularly their vocabulary. If we think about the delivery then, and delivery is not a great word. I always understand that, and it could be a better word. But this is what I mean by it. It means kind of everything. How you get the curriculum into action. How do you make it work? The first part of it is teaching. Teacher selection, teacher training, professional development, evaluation, monitoring. Everything that you associate with the teaching should be built in a way that reflects the expectations and the needs of the curriculum. There has to be a clear link. So if we decide to make a change in one aspect, then in the curriculum, for example, we've got to then look immediately at teacher training and teacher support. So to understand that for these changes to work, teachers need to be aware of them. They need to agree with them. They need to be trained to deliver them. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. The same can be said of materials. The textbooks are teacher-made or stuff that's downloaded off the internet or whatever. There has to be an understanding, and this comes back into teacher training and CPD, that teacher-made or downloaded materials have got to fit conceptually with what you're trying to achieve. So that means that the curriculum needs to be more explicitly written and transparent. It needs to be very clear to teachers. This is what I'm trying to do in this part of the curriculum. It shouldn't just be what we generally see as these high-level aims and objectives. Another thing that we have to think about, of course, and which is rarely discussed in our conferences at least, is this whole concept of the physical environment. Because there are so many times when we say, right, we're going to promote communication as the main focus of our language education. We can think about language education in a couple of different ways. We can think about it as a school subject, like it's the same as history or geography. You learn stuff, you learn words, you learn grammar, you pass a test. Or you can consider it from the perspective of communication. It's a tool, it's a means for communication. And communication, mediation, interaction. It's actually a working language. If you decide that your education system is aiming to produce people who can use the language in a real way, then you've got to think of the physical environment. Is the physical design of your classroom, of your school, is it likely to allow for the kind of communication, the kind of interaction, the kind of mediation opportunities that are needed for people to develop their language? Because if it's not, there is a problem. And I know it's far easier for me to stand here and say, you build new schools or build new classrooms than it is to actually build them and fund them. But if we are looking at a long-term policy, at a long-term plan, that's where we need to be going. We need to be thinking about these things. Is it realistic to be asking people to use language in a communicative way, in a way that means something, in an environment, for example, where the seats are bolted to the floor? So you can't actually move the furniture, and you can't actually move around. You can't get space to communicate. It's unrealistic. Another thing that's rarely mentioned, and it's only really been brought to my attention fairly recently, is this idea of leadership. That it's really important that leadership right across the system, from your senior teachers within a school department, your leadership within the school or within the region or within the nation, that all of those people must always also be, if you like, system literate. I've just invented that term. They must have a good understanding of the rationale and the focus of the whole education system, so that as they are the people who are expected to lead that system, they must know about all of these different elements, the teaching, the materials, the physical environment, etc. They must also know about the informal learning. They must learn about that and get to know the fact that their leadership, in terms of language, may be within the school, but they also have to think laterally that there are other opportunities out there. What can I do to either make those opportunities available or to point my learners in the direction of those opportunities? Because if I don't do it, well, they're not going to do it on their own, or they may not. And then we get an unequal situation. So leadership is critical. So within any education reform or any education movement, we need to consider not only all of these elements of the delivery, but also leadership, training leaders, and building a cadre of leaders who can help to bring a full understanding of the system right down to the ground, so that the people who are working in the classroom and who are studying, and their parents and everybody else involved in that system, fully understand what the system is trying to achieve, why it looks the way it does, and what are the kind of things that are expected of the people who are involved in that system at every level. When we think then of assessment, and I'll start kind of at the bottom here, I'm not a big fan of the term summative and formative assessment, because I think they're often misunderstood, and very, very often I've come across situations where people are talking about formative assessment because it's not a big exam, but they still say, well, we can do formative assessment and those scores count towards their final test score. And that's not right. That is still summative. It's just a different type of summative. So I prefer to use the terms summative is judgmental. If I give you a test or an assessment and I'm making a judgment about you, in other words, if I'm giving you a score or a grade, or I'm promoting you to another level, or I'm not promoting you to another level, or I'm giving you a job or I'm not giving a job, that's judgmental. That's a judgmental assessment. if I'm trying to help you to learn or to move forward in your learning, in your career, in whatever, that's a developmental assessment. And we don't generally try to blend the two. It's not a good idea. I've always taken pride in my ability to pass exams, even when I don't know very much about stuff. I just always liked exams, and I liked getting my way around the system. I won't call it cheating because I don't believe it's cheating, because what I'm trying to do in reality, what I'm trying to do is to beat the system. So when I'm taking a test, if you give me a test and tell me that, this test is going to count towards your score, your final score, I'm going to use every test-taking strategy I've ever learned to try to pass that test with the best score I can. So we can never claim that that's a purely developmental test. A developmental test is when you tell me, this is a test, Barry, this is designed to help you improve your Spanish. It's designed to give us an idea of what you know, what you don't know so well, and to give you an idea of what you might do to get better in that area. That's a developmental test. That's formative assessment. So let's work on that assumption then. The high-stakes summative tests in the system for school, university entry, exit, or recruitment are all critical. And it's critical that we get these right. It's critical that, for example, we get the transition from school to university. We get that transition test right. Otherwise, we're selecting the wrong people. We're either selecting the wrong people, or even worse, we're rejecting the right people. Well, no, that's not right. We're rejecting the wrong people. We're rejecting people who should go in, and we're accepting people who we should maybe not be accepting. So the university entrance and then exit into the recruitment market is critical, of course, but all school examinations are critical. And for them to really work, they need to work by reflecting back into the system. And I know that in some areas, and some theorists argue that no, the assessment should be clear of the system, it shouldn't be related to the system. For me, that's just not going to work. The reality is that the assessment has got to look at what we have asked people to learn and then assess them on their learning. Now, if I have an education system that doesn't really think about language as a tool of communication, sees language as a school subject that you just learn vocabulary and grammar, pass a test, that's okay. Then a grammar vocabulary test is probably okay. It'll do the job that you want it to do. Asking them to write an essay is just not fair. And it's giving you the wrong information about them anyway. So the idea here is that whatever you say, or however you set up your curriculum, however you set up your system, you've got to be consistent right through that system. The problem is that many systems out there are broken in some ways or other. They either have no formal curriculum or not a well-documented curriculum. It's too vague. It's too difficult for the people who are using it to interpret it. It's just not a transparent document. It's too difficult to use, or in some cases, it's impossible to use. And I remember when I graduated to start my teaching career as a secondary teacher in Ireland many, many years ago, I felt that was a real issue for me, because we were looking at a new curriculum, we were told, within a couple of years of starting, and we all had to learn that curriculum and get used to seeing how we could apply it. But when we actually saw it, it was so vague and short that you had no idea what to do. So essentially, people just kind of kept doing what they were doing before. So the new changes were really useless to us. And I maybe it's me, it follows me. When I lived in Japan, we had the same issue with changes to the curriculum for English language teaching and learning. It was to move to, in about early to mid 90s, I think it was 94, the plan was to move to a more communicative orientation for language learning in schools. But the entrance exam never changed. So we had just had a different type of problem then. We had an assessment that didn't fit with the rest of the curriculum. And of course, at the same time, the delivery system wasn't actually updated to deal with the new curriculum. So you had two problems happening at once. In fact, in many cases, we have all of these things are just random almost. I've seen instances, not at all unusual, of a curriculum that's simply copied from someplace else. A delivery system that is what we've always done. No real changes, no thought to reflect on the curriculum. And then an assessment that's either copied from a well-known test, or if the country is wealthy enough, actually that well-known test. So you have education systems and learning systems that are completely broken. There's no connection across these elements. And then education ministers and ministries and policymakers wonder, why isn't it working? Why are people not coming out of our systems able to read and write and speak in English? Well, they don't, because there's no connection across the system. The system doesn't work. Right then, how might we make that system work? Well, the first thing we have to think about is the system has to be underpinned by a set of comprehensive language standards or a language framework such as the CEFR. For the system to work, there's got to be a driver. That driver has got to sit at the center of the system. Now, I've given the example of the CEFR, but it's not the only driver out there. Obviously, there's Australian benchmarks, there's Canadian language benchmarks. There are various other language benchmarks, frameworks, and standards that are out there. The critical thing is that there is one, a standard. My own view is that having a European standard is just about okay. It just about works, I think, across Europe, because in Europe, it has been interpreted in different ways. And the CEFR, for example, has been translated into different languages. That's what they tell us. Of course, we know it hasn't been just translated. We know that right from the beginning, when the original English versions and French versions of the CEFR were produced, it was realized that they had to be different, that there are different pathways, if you like, through the different languages. Some of the most obvious ones are, in English, counting things is very simple. One computer, one bottle, one fork, one glass. If I speak Mandarin or I speak Japanese, then I have a different word for each object depending on its shape. So counting, very basic counting in one language, in English, is going to be, let's say, an A1 element, whereas counting in Mandarin or Japanese is going to be spread from the very, very basic ichi, ni, san, chi, o, Japanese, to far more complex ways of looking at how objects can be counted. So that's going to be at a much higher level. So we have to understand that the CEFR may work in one context, but it's not, and it may be that it has had a fantastic influence, and I believe it has had a fantastic and a positive influence around the world over the last couple of decades. But it needs to be localized. We need to think about the CEFR or other frameworks and think, are they actually fully appropriate to my context? Because if they're not, it's unlikely that it's going to work, or it's going to work well. But it's not even as simple as that. This is a simplified version of a diagram that I've used a number of times, and I thank Jamie Dunlea for pointing some of these key elements of this out to me. This was basically a design for the socio-cognitive approach to test development and validation. And Jamie quite rightly suggested to me that, well, we could actually look at the comprehensive learning system in the same way, in that the system itself when it's designed, and you can see it as I've presented it today. But underpinning the system, we have a development model. So we understand the language development, and we understand that through the CEFR or some other language framework or language standard. But we also have a measurement, so underpinning, so that we can actually scale development in the same way as the CEFR and others are scaled, statistically scaled. We would have a measurement scale running behind our system, not dominating our system as it sometimes happens. And in, for example, a lot of US theory on validity, it's massively dominated by measurement, where actually it needs to be dominated by development, as far as I'm concerned. But measurement is still very, very important. The side of the diagram that I want you to think about a little bit are the consequences box. And when we think of consequences, it's consequences for who? And I think about the stakeholders, and this can be everything from the learners, the parents and guardians, the teachers, the school district, the national ministry, right through. There's going to be a whole range of people who make up those stakeholder groups. For them to buy into the system, there needs to be a theory of action. So the people who are developing that need to say, this is what I want to achieve, right? As sort of and this is how I'm going to do it. But you can only do that in tandem with and cooperation with the stakeholder group. And those will include the education experts, language experts, assessment experts, the whole gamut. Everybody will be involved. To get our theory of change, as we'll call it, this is what we want to achieve in the next 10 years, for example. We then say, right, this is what we want to achieve. This is how we want to achieve it. And we work with everybody to understand and to develop a plan. This is exactly how we want to do it. And at the same time, we think about a communication model. So the communication model is winding back into those stakeholders and saying, this is what we're doing to achieve this, as we're trying to achieve it. And then when we've done it, this is what we've done. And this is what we've achieved, or this is what we haven't not yet achieved, and this is how we think we're going to have to move to make that happen. And of course, the critical bit, the critical 3 words probably in that whole page is context of use. You see it twice. It's like New York. Context of use. Everything we do is relevant to the context. We can't just say, wow, look at what they've done in this country. Let's just do what they've done. It works really well. Well, you're likely to face a disaster, because the context of use, the reason the system works well is it's taken the context of use into account. It's developed the right theory of action and the right communication models through its stakeholders. The stakeholders are different. Because they're different, everything else is going to be different. There will be similarities, and you may look at other systems and say, these things may work in my area. These things are things that are unlikely to work. We've got to reflect on those. So just a couple of conclusions before we finish. First point, education structures should be thought of as systems. I've tried to make that point from the very beginning. It's an entire system. If you take one bit out of one system, it's going to affect all the other bits. There's this symbiotic relationship, if you like, between the elements of the system. We can't simply change one element without changing the other. If there's a lot of people think I can change the national examinations and that'll force teachers to teach differently. It won't. It will only help them to think differently if they receive the kind of support that they need in the first place. And if it's reflected in the curriculum. Everything has to work in tandem, otherwise your system is going to fail. All elements must be fully addressed and integrated. And what I mean by that is, when we think of the delivery box, for example, we have to think of every one of those elements, the teachers, the selection of the teachers, the materials, the architecture, the leadership, everything. We've got to think of all elements and fully address all of them and fully integrate all of them. So we really need to think about the whole thing as one structure, one element. But of course, integration alone isn't enough. The learning system must be driven by a language standard or framework. If you don't have that, you don't have anything to base it on. It's like the skeleton that sits inside you. Without that skeleton, you don't have a system. It'll never work. And of course, for it to work, the system and the standards and the frameworks, as far as I'm concerned, must be locally appropriate. If they're not locally appropriate, you don't have a system in the first place, because you can't just borrow somebody else's system and hope it works. You can borrow their bicycle, you can borrow their car, it'll work, but you can't borrow their education system. And for those people who look to other places, and we see it all the time, I like this little quote: you may think the grass is greener on the other side, but if you take time to water your own grass, it would be just as green. And I leave it at that. If you want to read the full paper that this idea is based on, you can find it by scanning that, whatever this QR code, and it'll take you to the British Council website. The document is called the Comprehensive Learning System. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor. There is a lot of commentary in the chat. Lots of people interacting with your presentation. We have selected a couple questions here that we would like to ask you. So this one comes from Gladys Quevedo from Brazil. I know Gladys. Thank you,
I know Gladys too.
There you go. So she says, Professor, nowadays with the pandemic and the remote teaching, apps have become part of a normal learning. That affects the system too, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely it does, because apps can link the formal and the informal learning. And one of the problems that I've seen with some of the apps that are out there is that they don't reflect fully the formal learning system. So they don't reflect the curriculum. So people are taking apps and assuming that they're working without really evaluating them properly and saying, are they actually contributing in a way that I think they should be contributing to the system? And, I'm not saying they don't work. Some of them are fantastic. They really work very well. But you need to evaluate it first before using it. If you don't, I think it can be a real issue for people, because if you don't evaluate it before you use it, how do you know it's going to work? So, and then there are other apps, of course, that are designed to do a different thing. They're basically designed to just give you general practice, and those are non-curriculum specific, and those are fine. That's kind of an opportunity for informal learning. So thanks for the question, Gladys. I hope you're doing well.
Great. And then we have another one from Nick Seville. I don't know, Nick, where you're from, but here it goes. In what way is language learning the same or different from other types of learning? How do these similarities or differences impact the system?
I think that's a fantastically good question, and a very difficult question to answer in some ways. Very simple in some ways. I think the big difference between language and others is language is a critical means of communication between humans, and nowadays even between humans and machines. It's not simply a school subject. I think there is a danger of looking at language as being a school subject, and that's all it's designed to do. It's designed to basically sort out people. Some people can pass, some people can fail. And then people will look at a whole population and they'll say, well, I want 16% to pass at this rate. I want 34% to pass at that rate. So they'll put a nice normal curve on it and they'll think everything is normal. The problem is that language should be, as far as I'm concerned, about communication. So when we design learning systems, we really do need to start thinking about how we design language as a communication activity, not just a school subject. And that's often a very difficult one to get around, because in many, I work in quite a few countries, and quite a few of those are in East Asia, where there's a very clear argument from very many people that it's a school subject, the same as all the others, and it's not meant to be a language. that our own language is the important language. English isn't that important. That's foreigner stuff, and that's a problem.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.